Hi, it's Nicole. I got two piles of books to tell you about in this video. The first one is this. This pile has most of the options for August. We'll talk about the theme for August and we'll look through all of this one by one a bit later. And the smaller pile has all of the, most of the books I read in July. These are the Jane Austen July books. We'll start with this. I also finished reading A Suitable Boy, and I have quite a few thoughts to share about that one, so we'll talk about that in a separate video. Otherwise this one is going to be either too long or too rushed, so we'll start with the Jane Austen July books. So for Jane Austen July I read two pairs of books. They work quite well. The first pair is Jane Austen Selected Letters with Lucy Worsley's Jane Austen at Home, the biography. The biography is excellent, a very good balance between information and entertainment, and it's largely in chronological order from Jane Austen's birth all the way to her death, mentioning all her works. In addition to herself, Jane Austen herself, I got to know her family quite well. They played a big role in her life. So, for example, who was the first to encourage her to write, not only to write but also to get published? Who took the financial risk to help her publish her major novels and personally harassed the publishers? And all the different addresses she lived in and with whom? And also who visited her before she died and who didn't visit her. But I think there's a bit of confusion on page 398. It says James, her eldest brother, didn't visit her before she died, and neither did Frank from Charlton. It was Henry and Charles, Jane's particular little brothers, who did pay farewell visits, but even they did not stay. I wonder if Lucy Worsley mixed up Henry and Frank, because it says Henry and Charles, Jane's particular little brothers, visited. But Henry was not a little brother. Henry was one of the elder brothers, and also earlier on she specifically said Charles and Francis, so Frank, were their sister's particular playthings. So I wonder if she mixed them up, but that's just a small detail. Lucy Worsley's take on Jane Austen's life and works is very interesting. She believes the most important thing in Jane Austen's novels is not love or marriage, and what Jane valued most in her life was not marriage either, but sisterhood and female friendship between single women. There are many examples in the biography, and it was certainly the case when Jane was sick during the last few months of her life as she lay there dying. It gives a great deal of historical detail that helps make sense of her life, as well as her letters. I shared my thoughts and observations of the first half of these letters in my previous video, so I won't repeat myself here. I'll only talk about the second half of her letters, and it's particularly interesting to hear her talking about her novels. When she wrote her novels over the years in secret, you couldn't tell she was working on them at all. She didn't mention them in her letters, even to her sister Cassandra. It's only after the novels were published, or when they were nearly being published, she started to write about them, and she wrote quite a lot about them. They had an unwitting friend who didn't know Austen was the author of this new novel, so they invited her over and spent 2 evenings reading Pride and Prejudice out loud and closely watched her reaction. On the first evening, Austen was pleased with her reaction. She wrote, "She really does seem to admire Elizabeth." But on the second evening, Austen was less pleased, and she blamed her mother for not reading the novel very well. She was generally pleased with various people's opinions and reviews in the newspaper and magazines, and she genuinely loved what she created. She wrote, "I must confess that I think her, Elizabeth Bennet, as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print, and how I shall be able to tolerate those who do not like her, at least, I do not know." She searched through portraits in galleries for a likeness of her heroines, and she managed to find Mrs. Bingley. It is not thought a good collection, but I was very well pleased, particularly, pray tell Fanny, with a small portrait of Mrs. Bingley, excessively like her. I went in hopes of seeing one of her sister, but there was no Mrs. Darcy. Perhaps, however, I might find her in the great exhibition, which we shall go to if we have time. Mrs. Bingley's is exactly herself. Size, shaped face, features, and sweetness. There never was a greater likeness. She is dressed in a white gown with green ornaments, which convinces me of what I had always supposed, that green was a favourite colour with her. I dare say Mrs. Darcy will be in yellow. According to the notes, the portrait Jane Austen saw was of a woman called Harriet Quentin. The portrait Jane Austen saw does not exist anymore, but another portrait of the same woman still exists. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me present you Mrs. Bingley. So this is roughly what Jane Austen imagined Jane Bennet looked like. What do you think? Do you like the look of her? Leave me a message. And after being to another exhibition, she wrote, I am disappointed, for there was nothing like Mrs. Darcy at either. I can only imagine that Mr. Darcy prizes any picture of her too much to like it should be exposed to the public eye. I can imagine he would have that sort of feeling, that mixture of love, pride, and delicacy. It's also interesting to read her own critics on Pride and Prejudice. She wrote Pride and Prejudice when she was 21, the same age as Elizabeth Bennet, but she had to wait for a few years and did some revision before the novel was published, and now obviously she was older. So she wrote, the work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense, if it could be had, if not of solemn specious nonsense about something unconnected with the story. An essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott, or the history of Bonaparte, or anything that would form a contrast and bring the reader with increased delight to the playfulness and epigrammatism of the general style. I wonder if that little paragraph gave Thackeray the idea for Vanity Fair. When I first read Vanity Fair, it read very much like a Jane Austen novel. It's about income, security, marriage, female companionship and friendship, valiant soldiers. It's even set during the same time. It's set during Napoleonic Wars, which is the same time as Jane Austen, when Jane Austen lived. And there's one thing though that's very different. Thackeray did comment on bigger historical events, for example the Battle of Waterloo, which I loved very much. Some of you might have read Vanity Fair this month because of Jane Austen July. What do you think? Do you see similarities? Let me know. Let's talk about the next pair of books, What Matters in Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice. It's been a while since I read Pride and Prejudice and I've forgotten a lot of the details. It goes without saying, but I was struck once again how good a story this is. I listened to it on audiobook and listened in big chunks, and the progress of her feelings and emotions was straightforward and very easy to follow. Lizzie Bennet hated Mr. Darcy with all good reasons and justifications. Lizzie Bennet started to doubt her judgment and decisions after reading his letter. Lizzie Bennet decided she loved him after all, especially after seeing his property and hearing the glowing opinions of his housekeeper. And as soon as she was eager to marry him, the scandal broke out and she couldn't possibly be accepted anymore. She wanted now to marry him, but she has lost her chance. What regret! But obviously in the end all was well. I was mostly impressed by Lizzie Bennet's energy. For example, after she failed to persuade her dad not to let Lydia go to Brighton, she was anxious, but if her father's mind was made up, she was happy to get on with life and not worry about it anymore. Another example, after looking forward to go to the lakes for month and month, she was told she couldn't go after all. She was disappointed for a couple of lines and she was content again. I greatly admire her easiness of mind. The reading experience was made more interesting because of what matters in Jane Austen. This is a collection of essays observing and analysing some quirky themes in all of Jane Austen's novels. I would have never paid any attention to any of these details, let alone make connections that these are actually her techniques and intentional themes. I paid special attention to them while reading Pride and Prejudice this time. Here are a few examples. One interesting detail is people's age, how old they are actually in the books, in the novels, and how old we imagine them to be. For example, Mr. Collins was only 25, and a lot of you got that correctly in the quiz. But the actors in a lot of the screen adaptations were a lot older. And if Jane Bennet, the eldest Bennet daughter, was 23, then Mrs. Bennet was probably only in her 40s. Another thing is sisters' relationship. We think of Jane and Lizzie Bennet. They were the closest friends and their intelligence and senses were at the same level. But there are also other types of sisterhood. Kitty and Lydia, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips. It also makes me think of the women in the novels who did not have sisters. The ones comes to mind immediately are Miss Darcy and Miss de Bourgh. They both had a lady companion, but they had no sisters. It's interesting to notice the things in common between them. They both spoke very little. They both felt very timid and fragile. Could this is my theory, could having sisters make you a more robust person, even though the outcome could be for good, like Jane and Lizzie Bennet, or for evil, like Kitty and Lydia. Another example is how people address each other, especially between husband and wife. Apparently, according to the book, it was rare in Jane Austen's novels that husband and wife refer to each other with their first name. I noticed in Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet always referred to her husband or spoke to her husband as my dear Mr. Bennet, but I also noticed Mr. Collins called Charlotte Lucas his amiable Charlotte as soon as they were engaged. These are interesting details to pay attention to while reading Pride and Prejudice. They make a familiar story fresh and more enjoyable to reread. About Pride and Prejudice itself, my only complaint is it's too light, like the author wrote in her own letter. I love a story more when there is a zooming out and a zooming in, like Vanity Fair or A Tale of Two Cities. There are minute descriptions of a woman's mind, her frustration, pride, regret, humiliation, and joy. It focuses intensively and inwardly onto oneself. There's a world out there which, through her brothers, Austen was well aware and was connected, but she decided not to include them in her stories. Austen wrote in one of her letters about a battle just happened in Europe. How horrible it is to have so many people killed, and what a blessing that one cares for none of them. I find it quite shocking. She knew about it and she chose not to care about it. Did she really not care about it at all? I'm sure there are fine nuances and subtle feelings in that statement. For example, she must have been very thankful, very glad that her brothers in the Navy were alive and safe. She could also mean that maybe she knew no one among the number that were killed, and she was thankful for that, and each family must mourn for its own loss. Or maybe she just didn't care for any of them, and she was brutally honest about it. But that's rather an accurate sentiment of Pride and Prejudice. Thousands of people were killed on the battlefield, but Lizzie Bennet's feeling was hurt because her beauty was judged as only tolerable. I know that's controversial. Leave me comments and we can discuss. My dislike of the inward lookingness of Pride and Prejudice is just my personal preference. It's not a defect of Jane Austen's novel because she was aware of it and that was her decision. Writing to her nephew about his writing, she famously wrote, "What should I do with your strong, manly, spirited sketches full of variety and glow? How could I possibly join them onto the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labour?" She limited herself to a 2-inch wide piece of canvas and made a splendid world. What kind of world was this? A very realistic one, and one that she knew well. And that links us nicely to the next thing I read, Johnson's essay on fiction. Jane Austen read Johnson's essays. She mentioned it in her letters. I don't know if she read this one specifically, but the essay on fiction definitely describes the kind of novel Austen wrote. Johnson observes the works of fiction that are popular during his time are realistic stories about lives that everyone lives, knows, and therefore could comment on. It's a more difficult type of novel to write as a result. He compares the realistic type to heroic romance. I don't know exactly what he has in mind, but I guess something like Beowulf or Fairy Queen or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He describes the works of heroic romance usually employ giants to snatch away a lady and knights to bring her back from captivity. Almost all the fictions of the last age will vanish if you deprive them of a hermit and a wood, a battle and a shipwreck. So I guess these are what we now call high fantasy. It's interesting to think for us readers of 21st century, realism is the mainstream and fantasy is a smaller branch. But at Johnson's time, fantasy was the mainstream and realism was a new rising genre. Johnson continues to argue that because the novels now are more realistic and closer to life, young people are more likely to copy the characters in the novels. For example, while no one would copy Sir Gawain to travel across the country and search for a green giant, I'm sure many would look at Elizabeth Bennet and think, I want a Mr. Darcy too. Therefore, authors should pay more attention to what they write. They have a moral responsibility. If you create a villain, don't make them so wonderful and desirable that people end up admiring their deceitfulness, for example, and copying their evil ways. If you think of the characters in Pride and Prejudice, you can tell Austen followed Johnson's advice, knowingly or unknowingly. So those are all the books I read in July. Let's now plan for August. August, I plan to read books that are set outside England. Because of my Reading Oxford project, I try to focus on reading English classics all the year round. But in August, I usually have a holiday, have a break from English classics. So last August, I read translated classic literature from around the world. And this year, this pile, most of them are not translated and most of them are not classics. My criteria is just mainly they are stories from outside England or they are stories that are set outside England. It's a bit like travel around the world in books. I'm also combining an effort to reduce the pile of my unread books. So all of these are actually from my own shelves. I haven't bought any new books. And also out of the 12 books here, only 3 are new books. All of the rest are secondhand books, which is quite good. And there are also 2 library books that are on their way. So let's look through them. I'm not reading all of them at all, so I'd like your opinion and your advice which to prioritize. So let's look through them by location. Let's look at the ones from Asia first. So these 3 are set in Asia. How We Disappeared. This is a historical fiction set during the Japanese occupation of Singapore in World War II. And Pachinko is also a historical fiction set in 20th century Korea and possibly Japan. Tigers in Red Weather is a non-fiction book about the author's search of red tigers across Asia. It's a combination of natural history, adventure, and memoir. All of these are written in English. Moving now from Asia towards Europe, we are now on the border of Europe and Asia. My Name is Red is a murder mystery set in the 16th century Istanbul. This is translated from Turkish. 4 from Europe, 2 translated from French. One is Madame Bovary, a 19th century classic, and the other one is The Elegance of the Hedgehog. It's about an older lady concierge and a 12-year-old girl living in a Parisian apartment building, and how the death of one of their neighbors affects their lives. It's very intriguing. This was recommended by Lena, a booktuber, ages ago, and I managed to find the second copy, so I thought maybe I can read this one. And one modern classic, a chess story. This is translated from German, and another one translated from Swedish is called My Grandmother Sends Her Regards and Apologies. I think the title is slightly different in the US, so that sounds intriguing. Sounds quite cozy as well. Closer to home, 2 by authors from Wales. One is translated from Welsh. It's The Plum Tree. It's a short story collection. I'm not sure exactly what it's about. It says the author's preoccupations include religious dogma, family life, friendship, and the duality, which he saw as the defining characteristics of human behavior. And the next one, 20,000 Saints, is by a Welsh author, but I think it was written originally in English. And this is about an archaeologist returned to his childhood island, and a sister, presumably a Catholic sister, who is a heretic and a host of a hermit conference, and a documentary maker who is making a documentary of this island, which has a bit of a dark side that not many people know, something like that. I'm seeing the person who gave me these 2 books very soon, so I feel like I should read one of these quickly. 2 from the US, The Color Purple. It's a modern classic. It's set in the deep American South between the wars, about a young black girl born into poverty and segregation. And the other one is Gilead. I don't know what it's about. It's about family or something like that. I just know everybody say it's amazing, I should read it. I read the first paragraph and it is really beautifully written. I told you last night that I might be gone sometime, and you said, where? And I said, to be with the good Lord. And you said, why? And I said, because I'm old. And you said, I don't think you're old. And you put your hand in my hand and you said, you aren't very old, as if that settled it. It's just really lovely. I think I might read this one. One from Canada, Alice Munro, Dear Life. It's another short story collection. The stories in Dear Life build to form a radiant, indelible portrait of just how dangerous and strange ordinary life can be. The last one is from Australia, Picnic at Hanging Rock. So you've now seen all of my books on this list. Which one do you think I should read first? Which one do you think I should definitely prioritize for this month? And I'll leave the rest till next year, because I'll always be reading books, novels from around the world in August. So personally, I think I will almost certainly be reading Madame Bovary, because last year I read Anna Karenina, and I quite like to be able to say in 2021 I read Anna Karenina, a Russian classic, and in 2022 I read Madame Bovary. And I also have a feeling just by reading the blurb, it says this woman, beautiful and bored, trapped in an unhappy marriage and this provincial life. So she started an affair, she started doing all sorts of not very nice things, but she in the end is still not satisfied. I just feel like it sounds a bit like Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair, and it would be quite interesting to compare them if they are similar. So maybe, yeah, I might read this one. And next, Gilead is just so beautifully written, and I am very tempted to read this one. And also The Elegance of the Hedgehog. It's just a very intriguing book, and I know Lena recommends some really good books, and I kind of trust her recommendation. Also, Tigers in Red Weather. It's a bit of a weird book, not something I would usually read. It's a gift again, but this is the only non-fiction book in this pile, so maybe I should read that one. And also those Welsh ones, I feel like I should read one of these at least to give an account of what I've been doing with her books. Otherwise she might not buy me books anymore in the future. Who knows? But yeah, just so many choice. I might do some polls. If you have opinion on which one I should read first, I might do some polls, so you can let me know. Or you can also leave me comments which one you highly recommend and which one you strongly don't recommend. Let me know. I will take your advice into account, definitely. So that's all for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next one.